Robin Matthews, Australia's only nuclear tour guide, takes tourists to visit a former atomic weapons test site in Maralinga, South Australia. Adam Ferguson for the New York Times MARALINGA, Australia, Maralinga, a barren stretch of land in South Australia's remote western desert, is the country's only former nuclear test site open to tourists. And Robin Matthews is Australia's only nuclear tour guide. Visitors to Maralinga, a deserted military installation the size of Manhattan, who expect to find their tour guide dressed in a yellow jumpsuit and ventilator mask are bound to be disappointed. Instead, Mr. Matthews, 65, can be found wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and a cigarette hanging from chapped lips. His skin, deeply tanned, is covered with the narrative of faded tattoos inked long before they were fashionable. Yes, there is still radiation here, Mr. Matthews said as he drove a minibus to the sites where the Australian and British governments dropped 7 bombs between 1956 and 1963, which dotted the Earth with huge craters and poisoned scores of indigenous people and their descendants. Back then, the government placed hundreds of human guinea pigs, wearing only shorts and long socks, in the front areas of the test zones. The effects of large doses of radiation were devastating. The Australian and British governments dropped 7 bombs between 1956 and 1963, which dotted the Earth with huge craters. Adam Ferguson for the New York Times. Nowadays, after a multi-million-dollar cleanup, radiation poses little danger to visitors, Mr. Matthews said, unless they choose to eat mouthfuls of dust. Maralinga, which means thunder in the extinct Aboriginal language Garrick, is an unlikely tourist destination. It is hot and arid, and at 700 miles west of Adelaide it is difficult to reach. When tours started in 2016, the village was accessible by only 2 flights a week from Ceduna, the closest large city, which itself had a population of fewer than 3,000 people. Sign up to the Australia letter to get news, insights and recommendations in your inbox each week, but the Maralinga Jaratja people hope to increase the number of visitors to the site this year. The Maralinga Jaratja administration, which operates the site, is increasing the number of regular flights to the village, increasing the length of the tour to 3 days and working with the South Australian government on a business plan to lure more visitors, said Sharon Yendall, the group's general manager. Don Richards, who served in Maralinga as a clerk in the Australian Air Force from 1963 to 1965, was one of the 1,000 tourists who have so far visited the site. I learned more in that tour than I really learned in the 2 years I was out there, he said. It was a pretty interesting place to be. A fairly motley crew lived at Maralinga once. The first nuclear test at Maralinga was conducted in September 1956, and was as big as the bomb dropped by the United States on Hiroshima, Japan. National Archives of Australia. Today just 4 people live full-time in Maralinga village, a veritable ghost town. Amid the old buildings are new lodgings built for tourists, complete with hot water and Wi-Fi. In the 1950s and 60s, at the height of the Cold War, 35,000 military personnel lived here. There was a permanent airstrip, then the longest in the Southern Hemisphere, plus roads, a swimming pool, accommodation and railway access. The first nuclear test was conducted in September 1956, 2 months before the Melbourne Olympics. That blast, as powerful as the bomb that the United States dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, was the first of 7 atomic bombs set off here. But it was the so-called minor tests that were the most harrowing. Carried out in secret, the tests examined how toxic substances, including uranium and plutonium-239, would react when burned or blown up. To ensure tourists' safety in the area, a zone was cleaned up by radiation scientists at the cost of more than 100 million Australian dollars, about $77 million. Around one area tourists can visit are 22 major pits, each at least 50 feet deep, encased in reinforced concrete to prevent dangerous radiation from seeping out. The site looks like a recently tilled garden bed, stretching out for hundreds of yards, in a near-perfect circle. Dotting the red desert earth are shards of twisted metal. Aside from a few feral camels loping nearby, it is still and silent. But on October 4, 1956, a nuclear landmine was detonated here, tearing a crater 140 feet wide and 70 feet deep into the Earth. The resulting atomic reaction took only a fraction of a second, but its effects on one indigenous family would last decades. The site of a building where nuclear bombs were built before testing. Adam Ferguson for the New York Times. In early 1957, Edie Milputty and her family were traversing the Great Victoria Desert Plains. The Milputties needed shelter for the night, and they came across this enormous hole where the ground was still warm. Mr. Matthews said, "They drank rainwater from the bottom and lit a fire. All the rabbits in the area seemed disoriented. They were easy pickings for dinner before the family went to sleep in the crater." 2 weeks later, Ms. Milputty delivered a stillborn baby. Later, her surviving children's children would all be born with physical and mental deformities. Mr. Matthews said, "This all happened right where we are standing." Survivors of the blasts, their children and grandchildren suffered from cataracts, blood diseases, arthritic conditions, stomach cancers and birth defects. In the 1980s, a royal commission investigating the tests awarded Ms. Milputty $75,000. There was no overt pressure or media scrutiny over what happened at Maralinga until the 1970s, when those injured by the tests came forward and a small group of journalists and politicians cast a more critical eye on the tests and the secrecy surrounding them. The Australian government has spent millions to make the site safe for tourists. Adam Ferguson for the New York Times. Mr. Matthews first visited Maralinga in 1972. His wife, Bella, is a member of the Anangu people, and when the land was decontaminated, the couple were asked to be Maralinga's first caretakers. One recent morning, Mr. Matthews busied himself with preparations for the arrival of a charter plane full of tourists. He would love it, he said, if indigenous people replaced him as the guides at Maralinga, though he also understands why they would choose not to. "We now bring our kids and our grandchildren here to explain what happened," he said. "This is their land and their ancestors' land. We now bring our kids and our grandchildren here to explain what happened," Mr. Matthews said. Adam Ferguson for the New York Times. A version of this article appears in print on April 16, 2018, on page A6 of the New York edition with the headline, "Australia aims to turn Cold War nuclear site into tourist hotspot."